Hello, welcome to Energy Impacts with David Blackmon. I am your host, David Blackmon, and with me today is a special guest, Dustin Van Liew from Energeo. He is the Senior VP of Global Policy at Energeo Alliance, which is an association of, well, I'm going to let you talk about it, Dustin, before we go into the Q&A. Take a few minutes to talk about Energeo, what its mission is, who its members are, and then we'll go from there.
Yeah, well, I appreciate it, David. Thank you for having me on your podcast. I look forward to the discussion with you on these topics. But the Energeo Alliance is the global trade alliance made up of the Geoscience or seismic survey companies as our core membership that acquire data around the world on behalf of the energy industry, in particular on behalf of oil and gas companies seeking to find locations where there might be hydrocarbons. This is both offshore and onshore. Today's topic, I think, is going to focus on the offshore space in the United States, but really our members are highly technical, highly scientific companies that utilize sound to create images of the subsurface of the Earth to inform where exploration drilling may occur, or where they may apply other energy sources, alternative or otherwise, offshore and onshore, where you need to utilize something that goes in, through, or on the surface.
So, it's seismic companies, and my audience is large oil and gas oriented, so they're going to understand the seismic piece of the process. But you also have other kinds of companies in your membership, right? Or am I wrong about that?
Yeah, there are multiple tiers of membership to our alliance, which includes those integrated energy companies, the oil and gas companies, as industry partners. And they are members in part because they see the importance of that first access or first presence of the energy industry, the upstream, where those geoscience seismic survey companies are trying to access authorizations from governments to deploy those surveys. And that's where we, the energy companies, and we as staff at Energeo Alliance have run into roadblocks where NGOs, non-governmental environmental organizations, attempt to delay or impede surveys because they know without that image or without that data of the subsurface, the oil and gas companies are very unlikely to drill and therefore ultimately produce hydrocarbons.
So what about the big wind companies offshore? Obviously the seismic surveys are a big piece of mounting those developments. And when we talked a few weeks ago, you indicated that, I think you said none of the wind company developers are part of your membership. Well, I guess, if the big major oil companies are, then BP and Shell have some wind interests. But none of the pure wind developers are part of your organization.
That's correct. None of the pure play wind companies are participating in the Energeo Alliance, but those companies do require, and for siting of offshore wind turbines, do require some level of geoscience data ahead of siting those turbines and those pylons. And there's, extensive work in this space in the North Sea and Northern Europe. We've seen it in fits and starts on the Atlantic seaboard in the US, but really not a focus, a main focus for our membership.
Sure. Yeah. And of course, now with the Trump administration's efforts, I think that industry is kind of winding down at this point. Boy, it's just been a rash of bad news for those folks here recently.
There certainly are challenges. If I could take just a moment there, we did see some questionable news stories on the Atlantic coast in the policy space, the political space, which is really my realm of expertise, when they were working to stand up those wind areas off the Atlantic, where some politicians indicated that sound from marine seismic sources impact the marine mammals in the Atlantic, which is not the case. And for over 60 years in the Gulf of America and extensively around the world, geoscience surveys have been utilized offshore without any deleterious impacts to marine populations. So it was a little bit unfortunate that some politicians on both sides of the aisle in Washington, D.C. were trying to scapegoat their opposition to wind by attacking the upfront exploration survey activities from our members in the Geoscience data acquisition. So, it's one thing if you oppose wind, but don't try to oppose that based on blaming seismic surveys, which again have occurred for decades.
Yeah, I looked at that science, and of course, I haven't been in the industry. I remember those allegations going all the way back into the Clinton administration. Really, we were dealing with it in the Gulf of Mexico related to a whale species. I can't even remember which one it was, but I mean, there's a lot of science around that essentially exactly the findings are exactly what you talk about there. But there is a bill right now. The reason we got together is this bill that Senator Nick Begich from Alaska has going on. He's not a senator; he's a representative. Excuse me, in the House of Representatives that would, amend the Marine Mammals Protection Act. In an effort to kind of streamline the process and also eliminate conflicts with other major environmental laws that have been causing severe waste of time. You testified at a hearing back in March, I believe, and then Forrest Burkholder, one of your members, testified at a hearing in July, a follow-up hearing on the discussion draft that Mr. Begich has going. Talk about what that discussion draft would do and why it's really important to the whole discussion around streamlining permitting for energy projects.
Well, again, I appreciate the opportunity to discuss this very important topic. And let me start out with Energeo Alliance has been focused on modernizing the Marine Mammal Protection Act for a number of years now, based on our members' struggles with the act, but also time after time, the agency's struggles with applying and implementing the statute. It was passed in the 70s among multiple environmental statutes in the Nixon era that were good intended statutes to protect the environment, protect marine mammals. But over time, because of the opposition to energy offshore, for example, NGOs have utilized or maybe even abused, you could say, the court system to twist the Marine Mammal Protection Act into something that was never intended by Congress. So that's why it's been a focus of ours, because we have seen extensive delays, not based on science, not based on potential negative impacts to the marine mammals, but just based on an attempt to slow the process for such time to delay until it's denied or delay until it becomes uneconomical and the companies look elsewhere around the globe. So this act has been one of those that we see could use some adjustment, some modernizing. Not to remove it. We don't have anything against, and in fact, our members support a healthy environment offshore, including the marine mammals that share the space where our activities occur, but to modernize the act to provide efficiencies and a better, clear understanding of exactly what the requirements are to get those authorizations under the Marine Mammal Protection Act, and also provide the agency staff and personnel efficiencies and better understanding of what Congress really means by prohibiting the take of marine mammals for activities that are approved offshore. And we can dive into Mr. Begich's discussion draft as well. Again, as a priority for us, it's to create a more efficient permitting process, not to curtail or get around any environmental protections that exist, but rather to better define it. So we all know exactly what the standards are for obtaining those authorizations under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. The act itself prohibits take, which is to hunt, harass, or kill marine mammals.
Right.
Harassment, obviously, can be a very broad term and interpreted in different ways. The statute attempts to define harassment to either potentially injure or potentially harass those species. One of the provisions in Mr. Begich's discussion draft would remove the word potential, because harassment's already broad, and then you're adding potential on top of that. It becomes even broader, and you can see where the agencies are unable to come up with a specific determination of the potential to harass or the potential to injure. Really, it could mean anything. We could go stick our toe in the Gulf of America, and that has the potential to harass a marine mammal that we may not see, right?
Swimming in the ocean has the potential to harass them.
Exactly.
So yeah, that's an incredibly broad standard. And of course, you talk about some of the environmental groups, corrupting what the original intent of these laws. That's happened not just with the MMPA, but with the Endangered Species Act, Clean Air Act, Clean Water Act, NEPA, on and on and on. Every one of those major statutes is now being applied in ways that the authors never intended or never could have possibly envisioned. And so it's a real driver of all of the delays, essentially, virtually all of the delays that are unnecessary in the permitting process at the federal level are driven by these major environmental statutes. And people need to understand that. So when you talk about, in Representative Begich goes about trying to draft a bill that would amend those laws, they're immediately come under attack from those same groups, with allegations that they're trying to destroy all the whales and kill all the dolphins. And, some of the comments at that hearing that were offered by the opponents of the bill were just completely outlandish and really, just designed to keep a controversy alive rather than try to look for solutions to a problem. And that's kind of a battle you're always fighting in these kinds of issues, isn't it?
Of course, emotion grabs headlines, emotion sells, emotion likely fills fundraising coffers for some of these entities that are just trading on misinformation about what provisions that have been proposed will do to the statute and could offer for efficiencies for both the government and for the regulated industry. And again, we're not looking for any free pass for around these environmental statutes, but rather let's make it make sense. Some rational application of these statutes. One of the other areas that Mr. Begich's bill deals with or proposes to deal with is deleting this term small numbers. It only appears 4 times in the statute, the MMPA, and it is duplicative or overlapping the other standard, which is a biological standard of having no more than a negligible impact on the marine mammals when you're authorizing activities when requests for take come from our members, for example, in offshore activities. So that term small numbers is included in almost every legal challenge that we see from the NGOs against government authorizations for take under the MMPA. And because it's not defined, it's left to judges to try to decide what it means to impact a small number of a population of marine mammals. This could be different based on the marine mammal, based on the area or location of the proposed activity. And what you find is the Ninth Circuit has said something like 12% of a population is a small number. The agency has authorizations in the Gulf of America that anticipate 33% of a population being a small number. And again, it goes to a judge to decide. So if you think about, in a fast food sense, there's a small French fry, a medium French fry, and a large French fry. Well, everything below 33% might be a small fry. Everything between 33 and 63 might be medium, right? So we shouldn't be asking judges to make this determination when it's not their area of expertise and it's still defined from Congress. So deleting that and relying on the negligible impact, which has biological implications, is more appropriate and very common sense edit that Mr. Begich has proposed.
Yeah, and there's a lot of science now around all of this that could form, real peer-reviewed science around all of this that should really be the basis for these decisions, shouldn't it? I mean, members of Congress have no idea about any of this stuff. Neither do judges. You're right about that. And shouldn't we be making these decisions on sound science and really nothing else? Clear guidelines around sound science.
Absolutely agree with that. Mr. Begich agrees with that because provisions in the statute that he's proposed to change would be to include a sound science provision or requirement for objective, sound, commercial, and scientific information. And it would also take another step in affirmatively blocking the use of what's called the precautionary principle. This is where agencies without access to data or up-to-date information will rely on precautious approaches to their proposed modeling for the impacts on what the activity may have, adding precaution in every step of the way, which ultimately multiplies on itself and creates this situation where they're authorizing hundreds of thousands of take of marine mammals in the Gulf of America, for example, when there are not hundreds of thousands of a given species. But because they've added precaution to their approach, to their modeling, to their analysis, it becomes a situation where the public thinks there's far greater impact from activities than is actually going to occur in reality. So Mr. Begich is proposing to block the use of precautionary principle, and actually the DC Circuit Court of Appeals on an ESA related case, Endangered Species Act related case, actually told Congress that they should be directing the agencies to use it or not to use it, depending on the preference of Congress. Again, it's up to Congress, but the agencies are going to use this precautionary approach if they're not specifically blocked from utilizing it.
Well, speaking of the Endangered Species Act, one of the key problems that I think you guys have focused on is the duplication of efforts between requirements under the MMPA and requirements under the EPA. The ESA. And, this causes delays of all kinds in these processes that shouldn't even exist. They only exist because of conflicting standards under the two laws. Talk about some examples of how that occurs and the impacts it has on your guys' operations.
Yeah, appreciate that question. And it really is an area to focus on if we're talking about efficiencies for the government. If we have multiple agencies and departments working on similar actions and then consulting with each other on those actions, the layers of decision making and time consumed by the bureaucracy for simple authorizations, it gets astronomical, and the bill continues to rise and the time continues to be extended on getting these authorizations. So Mr. Begich has really keyed into that area, and something that we as an industry have pointed to for a long time, both in the Gulf of America for our operations, but also in the Arctic, where we find species that are both listed as endangered or threatened under the Endangered Species Act, but are also marine mammals, so thereby protected under the Marine Mammal Protection Act. Now, the MMPA is administered by the Department of Commerce, National Marine Fisheries Service, and by and large, and the Endangered Species Act is administered by the Department of Interior and the Fish and Wildlife Service by and large. But then beyond that, David, you have species that can be under both jurisdictions. So the polar bear in the Arctic is protected under the MMPA, but the administration of that protection is also by the Fish and Wildlife Service for the MMPA, and it's listed under the Endangered Species Act. So that bear is onshore mostly, but can also be offshore. And so you can see where it quickly becomes a morass of dealing with various bureaucrats to get a simple geoscience authorization to conduct a survey.
Well, that's a really interesting thing about the polar bears. I think it probably comes as news to most people watching this that the polar bear is considered to be a marine mammal. But I guess it makes a certain kind of sense since they do spend a lot of time in the water, but still seems odd.
Let me dig in a little bit more on that overlap, and specifically where we have problems or we've seen potential problems. The rhesus whale in the Gulf of America, which was formerly understood to be a Brutus whale, is listed under the Endangered Species Act and obviously protected under the MMPA. The previous administration had proposed an expansive critical habitat designation across the entire Gulf on the shelf.
I remember that.
Which could have led to reduced speed requirements across that rainbow that went around the entire Gulf, other restrictions around night travel. Again, this usually just applies to oil and gas activities because we are federally regulated and maybe not applicable to shipping, for example, in all cases. So that layering of a critical habitat would go on top of the protection of that rhesus whale already, which is protected from take under the MMPA across all of its habitats, so really the entire Gulf. But it doesn't apply specific restrictions in specific areas like the critical habitat designation would. And then you get again into that situation where you have NOAA Fisheries consulting with Fish and Wildlife Service about one species for the same activities being proposed, but under two different statutes and two different regulatory mechanisms or multiple regulatory mechanisms that could be layered on for that one species. So y'all, your listeners can probably really quickly realize that getting authorizations and approvals from these various agencies can take an extensive amount of time. And at the end of the day, it doesn't provide any extra protection for that rhesus whale in the Gulf.
So I recently interviewed, as in July, actually, Emily Dominich, who heads up the permitting council for the administration, which was established in 2021, but is really ramping up their efforts now and looking for administrative solutions to these kinds of unnecessary delays in the permitting process. I wonder if, obviously, it's a lot simpler to implement changes in administrative processes in the executive branch than it is to get a bill passed in Congress. Are you aware of any ways that the permitting council could address some of these things? I mean, when you look at two conflicting laws with conflicting provisions being administered by different departments, it seems like there's an opportunity there to resolve some of this, at least within the executive branch, without needing an act of Congress. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that possibility.
I think this would be right in the wheelhouse of what I understand to be the permitting council, and we look forward to discussing with the council our priorities for efficiencies around the permitting, around the overlapping requirements among agencies. Again, it really would be great to see the administration act on that. One of the cautions that I would provide to that approach is that if you come to an administration that's less friendly on offshore hydrocarbon activities, they could simply reverse those administrative efficiencies. That's not to say it's not worth pursuing and trying to get implemented, because as you say, it's not as heavy a lift as it is to get something passed in Congress. But we look forward to working with the Trump administration. We've visited with White House staff, the Office of Management and Budget, for example, on the need for efficiencies. If the administration wants to realize the energy dominance that's included in the president's executive orders, they have recently passed, of course, in the One Big Beautiful Bill Act, the requirement that leasing occur offshore frequently. That leasing all relies upon new data and data available to those oil companies to determine where they would like to implement exploration drilling or drill for hydrocarbons. So you can lease extensively and regularly, but without these authorizations for geoscience surveys, the process necessarily grinds to a very slow position or even a halt.
Yeah. So we've had two hearings now this year, and what is your understanding of the next steps for Representative Begich's bill going forward? I mean, are there plans to try to actually introduce a draft bill in the House later this year?
So from my understanding, it is Mr. Begich's goal to see legislation introduced. Importantly for your listeners, it was provided as a discussion draft before our Vice Chair, Forrest Burkholder, testified at that hearing 3 weeks ago in the House, as a way for Mr. Begich to gather feedback from his constituents in Alaska, of course, and other industries that operate offshore that have been impacted by the Marine Mammal Protection Act. So it's not just geoscience surveys. The fishing industry has potential implications from the MMPA. Ports around our coastlines have requirements under the MMPA to comply with. So my understanding is that him and his staff and committee staff right now are obtaining feedback from the constituencies and industries to ensure that what is included in the discussion draft works for those industries, works for his constituents, ultimately will lead to the introduction of, we hope, legislation that would be very similar to and reflect that feedback on modernizing the MMPA. And then after that, David, they would have to go through a markup with the full committee, full Natural Resources Committee. And we know that Chairman Westerman has a focus on these 1970s environmental type statutes to modernize them into the current era. We saw him introduce National Environmental Policy Act, modernizing language. We saw Endangered Species Act modernizing language be introduced. So again, I think it's a focus of this Congress, this House, and even on the Senate side as well as we move into the fall, looking at what provisions make sense for the administration and for industry.
Well, it's a long and winding road to get from a discussion draft to final bill and passage, but it appears that it's well on the way here, and hopefully, with God willing, the thing will make its way into law sooner or later, because all these laws do need to be updated. Even even some of the authors of some of these bills have been gone on the record, years after their passage, and watching how they've been abused through the court system and by these environmental groups, talking about how this was never our intent when we wrote these laws. And so it's obvious that they have been expanded well beyond their original intent when President Nixon mainly signed most of them. We forget what a progressive Mr. Nixon was related to environmental protections, and that he signed the majority of these major bills during his time in office. For better or worse, I gotta admit, I'm a big fan of the Endangered Species Act, for example, as its original intent, which was to protect and save some of the most recognizable major animal species in the United States that were endangered at that time. And it's had only modest success in overall percentage of saving species, but some of the ones that were saved are species everyone would recognize. So, but not a big fan of applying it to the snail darter and the blind desert lizard of West Texas. Anyway, I appreciate you taking the time. We're running out of time here on this episode. I would really like to check back with you at the next inflection point related to this bill for a follow-up interview, and keep this discussion alive going forward.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to join you today, and I look forward to those future conversations. We agree that we hope to see Congress move on this. I think we have a unique opportunity with unified Congress and administration to see something passed that, again, will provide permitting efficiencies without reducing any protections or providing any impacts to those marine mammals. Thank you.
Yeah, and that's the key. You got to be able to show you're not reducing the protections in all of this, because that just disarms the opposition to this kind of reform. And I think that can be done. I think it can be done just based on the facts and the science. So wish you the best of luck and look forward to talking to you again in the near future.
Thank you, David.
Thank you. And thank you everyone for watching. We'll be back soon with another episode of Energy Impacts. That's all for today.